Have you ever sat in absolute silence while someone you loved publicly humiliated you, knowing all the while that you held the power to destroy their entire reality? I stood in the freezing shadows of a grand auditorium, forced to hide like a banished servant, while my own father mocked me in front of 2,000 decorated soldiers. He thought he was crushing a weak little girl who washed out of basic training. He had no idea he was actually insulting the chief architect of the Pacific Defense Strategy. What happens when a 20-year lie suddenly collides with a three-star general and a room full of Navy SEALs? Let me tell you, the silence that followed wasn't just deafening. It was the exact moment a tyrant's world burned to the ground. This is a story about discovering that true power doesn't come from arguing with a narcissist. It comes from knowing exactly when to let their own delusions destroy them. If you have ever had to stand tall while someone desperately tried to make you feel small, please hit that like button. Share this with a woman who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to join our community of unbreakable women. Tell me in the comments below, how did you finally break free from the toxic people in your life? I read every single one. Have you ever sat quietly while someone tried to make you look small, knowing all the while that you hold the power to dismantle their entire reality? My name is Clara. I am a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy and the Chief Architect of the Pacific Defense Strategy. But to my father, Arthur, I was just the weak little girl who supposedly washed out of basic training because she missed the comfort of her own home. He spent 20 years mocking me, crafting a relentless narrative of my failure to soothe the agonizing sting of his own career mediocrity. And for 20 years, I let him. I absorbed his microaggressions, his sneers, and his public belittlements, waiting for the day the truth would finally shatter his illusions. That day arrived under the bright California sun, at my younger brother William's Navy SEAL graduation. The ride to the Coronado amphibious base was a masterclass in psychological warfare. We were crammed into Arthur's aging pickup truck, a vehicle that smelled permanently of stale tobacco, cheap black coffee, and unearned arrogance. Arthur gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw set in a smug, self-satisfied line. In the passenger seat, my mother, Eleanor, folded herself inward. She was 62 years old, yet she sat like a frightened child, her hands tightly clasping a worn tissue. Her silence was a tragic testament to decades of trauma bonding. A woman conditioned to silence her own voice to appease the tyrant beside her. And then there was me, sitting in the back seat in plain civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer and slacks. I was purposefully unremarkable, a ghost in my own family. "Don't embarrass your brother today, Clara," Arthur said, adjusting his rearview mirror to glare at me. "This is a room full of real warriors. Try not to bring up your little pencil-pushing desk job." We don't need William's instructors knowing his sister couldn't even hack it through boot camp. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I simply looked out the window and offered a mild, non-committal hum. In psychological terms, this is known as the gray rock method. When dealing with a covert narcissist, giving them emotional reactions is like throwing gasoline on a fire. They crave your defense, your anger, and your tears because it validates their control. To defeat them, you must become as uninteresting and unresponsive as a gray rock. I had weaponized this psychological tactic for years, starving him of the drama he so desperately craved. My silence was not submission. It was a heavily armored bunker. As we approached the main security checkpoint, the imposing gates of the naval base loomed ahead. Arthur rolled down his window, puffing out his chest. He shoved his own expired, low-ranking logistics clerk identification card toward the armed guard, along with William's graduation invitation. "My son is graduating today," Arthur announced loudly. "Navy SEAL. The real deal." He pointed a thick thumb toward the back seat. "That's his sister. She's just a guest. Don't worry about her." The guard, a sharp-eyed petty officer, scanned Arthur's documents with mild disinterest before glancing into the back of the truck. His eyes locked onto mine. I saw the exact millisecond his pupils dilated. He had been a sentry at a classified briefing I had conducted 3 weeks prior. He knew exactly who was sitting in the back of this dusty pickup truck. His hand twitched, instinctively preparing to slash upward into a crisp, honor-bound salute. I held his gaze and delivered a microscopic, razor-sharp shake of my head. It was a silent, lethal command understood only by those trained in environments where a misinterpreted gesture could mean absolute disaster. The guard swallowed hard. He instantly masked his shock, handed the papers back to Arthur, and stepped back, instead of breaking protocol entirely. He subtly squared his shoulders toward the back door of the truck and offered a sharp, abbreviated nod of deep reverence. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with unspoken respect. Arthur snorted, rolling up the window and accelerating through the gates. "See that," Arthur chuckled, completely blind to reality. They still respect the old guard. They know a real veteran when they see one. I simply smiled a tight, empty smile. As we drove past the meticulously manicured lawns and towering concrete facilities of the base, Arthur began pointing out the architecture, criticizing the government's spending, waste of taxpayer dollars. He grumbled. He had no idea that I had personally authorized the $87 million budget for that exact facility. I looked over at my mother, whose eyes were fixed on her lap, and felt a profound sorrow for her. I knew today would be catastrophic for Arthur, but I prayed it would be the catalyst for Eleanor's liberation. I needed her to see that the man who had terrified her for decades was completely powerless in the face of genuine authority. The outdoor reception area was a vibrant sea of pristine white dress uniforms, polished brass, and proud families. The air smelled of salt from the nearby ocean and the faint, metallic scent of nervous anticipation. Arthur immediately took charge, marching ahead of us as if he were a decorated general inspecting his troops. He strutted through the crowd, clapping strangers on the shoulder and weaving fictitious tales of his own military glory days. I followed a few paces behind, carrying his heavy camera bag, playing the role of the dutiful, invisible daughter, every so often. I caught the eye of a high-ranking officer I had worked with in the Pentagon. Each time, I offered the same imperceptible shake of my head, enforcing a strict embargo on my true identity. I was not ready to detonate the truth just yet. We stopped near the refreshment tables, where Arthur spotted a highly decorated Navy captain standing with a group of veteran instructors. Arthur, unable to resist a captive audience, practically shoved his way into their tight circle. "Arthur Green," my father boomed, offering a heavy, overly aggressive handshake. "Former logistics. My boy William is graduating today. SEAL Class Bravo." The captain nodded politely, his demeanor professional but distinctly distant. Arthur then grabbed my arm and pulled me forward roughly. "This is my daughter. Clara, she tried the military thing once, but she washed out of boot camp. Now she just pushes papers at some boring desk job in DC. You know how it is. Captain, not everyone is cut out for the real work." Arthur laughed, a booming, obnoxious sound, fully expecting the superior officer to join in the casual misogyny and mockery. The captain did not laugh. His eyes shifted from Arthur's grinning face to me, and I watched the vivid recognition wash over his weathered features. He had read my strategic doctrines. He had likely executed covert orders bearing my signature. The captain's expression turned instantly to stone. He looked back at Arthur with a mixture of utter disgust and chilling incomprehension. To him, Arthur was not just a rude, overbearing father. He was a civilian brazenly insulting one of the highest-ranking women in the United States Armed Forces. The captain did not engage with Arthur's joke. Instead, he completely ignored my father's outstretched hand. He squared his broad shoulders, looked directly into my eyes, and spoke with profound, measured respect. "It is an absolute honor to have you on base, ma'am," he said, emphasizing the final word with a heavy, deliberate weight. "If you or your family need anything at all today, please let my staff know." Without another glance at Arthur, the captain turned and walked away. Arthur stood there, blinking in confusion. Arrogant brass, he muttered, aggressively shaking off the humiliating dismissal. Shortly after, the massive wooden doors to the main auditorium opened. The hall was breathtaking. A sprawling amphitheater of red velvet seats facing a brightly lit stage draped in the national colors. 2,000 seats, every single one filled with elite military personnel and their loved ones. Arthur marched down the center aisle, leading my mother toward the VIP seating in the very front row. When I stepped up to take the empty chair next to Eleanor, Arthur violently swung his heavy coat and camera bag onto the velvet cushion, aggressively claiming the space. No room, he stated coldly, not even bothering to look me in the eye. Go stand in the back. You're in the way here. A civilian desk worker doesn't belong in the VIP row anyway. I looked at Eleanor. I gave her one final, silent opportunity to speak up, to claim the seat for her own daughter. She lowered her head and gripped her purse, physically shrinking away from the conflict. I did not argue. I turned on my heel and walked the long, solitary aisle to the back of the auditorium, retreating into the freezing shadows near the emergency exits. I planted my feet shoulder-width apart, clasped my hands behind my back, and assumed a flawless posture of parade rest. Standing in the cold shadows, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace wash over me. For 2 decades, I had carried the suffocating weight of my father's insecurities. I had allowed him to paint me as a failure to protect his fragile ego. But as I watched the 2,000 decorated men and women settle into their seats, I realized that true strength is not found in the endless endurance of abuse. True strength is knowing exactly when to stop participating in someone else's delusion. I watched William take his place on the stage among his fellow graduates. He looked incredibly young, his face pale with a mixture of pride and nervousness. I loved my brother, and I had endured this day entirely for him. But the time for hiding was rapidly coming to an end. The air in the massive room grew thick and heavy, charged with the electric anticipation of the ceremony. On the stage, the commanding officer stepped up to the podium to introduce the keynote speaker, General Robert Hayes. Down in the front row, Arthur shifted in his velvet seat, puffing his chest out, completely unaware that his 20-year reign of psychological terror was about to be obliterated by a single introduction. The auditorium fell into a profound, reverent hush as General Robert Hayes approached the podium. He was a towering figure of military authority, a man whose chest was adorned with decades of commendations, and his mere presence commanded absolute silence from the 2,000 attendees. The stage behind him was lined with the graduating Navy SEALs, pristine in their white dress uniforms, representing the absolute pinnacle of physical and mental endurance. Among them stood my brother, William, his face a canvas of nervous pride. From my exiled position in the freezing shadows at the very back of the hall, I watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of a strategist surveying a chessboard. Down in the velvet-lined VIP section, Arthur was completely in his element, oblivious to the fact that his carefully constructed reality was standing on a landmine. He sat with his legs splayed wide, his arm draped arrogantly over the back of the empty chair he had denied me, looking around to ensure the other families were noticing his prime seating. General Hayes adjusted the microphone, his piercing gaze sweeping over the massive crowd. Today we gather to honor the extraordinary resilience of these young men. The general began, his voice a deep baritone that resonated through the acoustic panels of the hall. But behind every warrior on this stage is a network of brilliant strategic minds, architects of defense who operate in the shadows to ensure our nation's survival. It was a standard opening, dignified and serious. But Arthur's pathological need for attention could not allow a moment of silence to pass uncorrupted. Sensing an opportunity to elevate himself by stepping on my neck, Arthur leaned forward. In a room so quiet you could hear a pin drop, he turned his head toward the back of the auditorium, located me in the shadows, and projected his voice with the obnoxious clarity of a high school bully holding court. "Hey, Clara," Arthur called out, his mocking tone echoing off the walls. Maybe if you hadn't cried your way out of military camp, you'd actually have a seat down here with the real heroes. A collective, stunned silence swallowed the room. It was not the silence of respect, but the suffocating silence of communal shock. People in the adjacent rows turned to stare at Arthur, their expressions twisting into disbelief. But the most visceral reaction came from the stage. William, standing at rigid attention, suddenly turned pale. His composure broke entirely, and a loud, audible gasp escaped his lips, carrying through the ambient microphones. He stared at his father in absolute, unadulterated terror. He knew. William had always known what I really did, but he had been too afraid of Arthur's wrath to ever speak the truth. Now he was watching his father detonate a bomb in a room full of four-star brass. Arthur chuckled, looking around at the officers near him, expecting them to share in the joke. Instead, he found only stone-cold glares. General Hayes did not miss a beat. He did not look at William, and he did not look at the crowd. His eyes locked onto Arthur like a laser targeting system. The temperature in the auditorium seemed to plummet when the general spoke again. His voice was no longer a welcoming baritone. It was the chilling, metallic sound of a weapon chambering around, the general said, the word dripping with an icy disdain that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The woman you are attempting to disrespect did not fail military camp. She was quietly pulled from basic training over 2 decades ago to be recruited into the highest echelons of naval intelligence. Arthur's arrogant smile froze, slowly cracking at the edges. His brain struggled to process the words echoing through the speakers. I am deeply honored, General Hayes continued, his voice rising to a commanding roar that shook the floorboards, to acknowledge the presence of the chief architect of the Pacific Defense Strategy. We are graced today by Rear Admiral Clara Vance. The title dropped into the auditorium like a bunker-busting munition. Down in the VIP row, all the blood drained from Arthur's face, leaving him the color of wet ash. His mouth fell open, but his vocal cords were utterly paralyzed before he could even twitch. The base commander on stage stepped forward and delivered the most powerful command in the naval arsenal. Attention on deck. What followed was a seismic event. 2,000 officers, enlisted personnel, and graduating SEALs moved as a single, monolithic entity. The sound of 2,000 pairs of combat boots and dress shoes, snapping together on the hardwood floor, sounded like a thunderclap inside the enclosed hall. Every single person in the room rose to their feet, every uniformed arm sliced through the air, crashing to their temples in a forest of razor-sharp salutes. And every single salute was directed away from the stage, bypassing Arthur completely, and aimed directly at the dark corner where I stood. I stepped out of the shadows, my spine a steel rod, and returned the salute with flawless precision. I held it as the room remained frozen in absolute, deafening silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody whispered. There was only the crushing, suffocating silence of an entire military installation station honoring the woman Arthur had just called a failure. He was the only person left sitting in the entire auditorium, crushed beneath the weight of 2,000 staring eyes, his 20-year delusion utterly and publicly annihilated. The walk back to the parking lot after the ceremony was a masterclass in tension. The California sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. William had joined us, his face still flushed with a mixture of residual adrenaline and profound relief. My mother, Eleanor, walked a few paces behind me, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. The atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The invisible chains that had bound us to Arthur's tyrannical narrative had been shattered in front of 2,000 witnesses. Arthur marched ahead of us, his shoulders hunched, his breathing erratic. He was a cornered animal, frantically searching for a way to rewrite the catastrophic humiliation he had just endured. When we finally reached his aging pickup truck, the facade completely crumbled. He spun around, slamming his fist against the hood of the truck with a hollow, metallic thud. You set me up, Arthur hissed, his face twisted in a desperate, ugly rage. He pointed a trembling finger at me. trying to reclaim his stolen authority. You planned this whole thing just to humiliate me in front of those people. You made me look like a fool. What do you know about real sacrifice anyway? Sitting in some air-conditioned office in Washington. It was a textbook gaslighting attempt, the final. Pathetic weapon of a covert narcissist whose mask had just been ripped away. He was trying to rewrite history in real time, casting himself as the victim of an ungrateful, vindictive daughter. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. And I did not offer him the emotional reaction he was starving for. Instead, I calmly reached into my blazer pocket. I pulled out a heavy, folded document, encased in a protective sleeve. It was heavily redacted, but the gold seal and the bold, official typography were unmistakable. I handed it to him. Arthur snatched it, his eyes darting across the page. It was my Silver Star commendation from 12 years ago. Read the second paragraph. Arthur, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, as flat and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. He read it silently, his lips moving over the words that described a chaotic ambush in a hostile desert, a compromised unit, and the 2 bullets I took to the shoulder and thigh, while dragging my communications officer to safety under heavy enemy fire. I didn't set you up, Arthur, I stated, watching the fight completely leave his body. I just stopped hiding your mediocrity to protect your ego. I watched the exact moment his reality broke. But more importantly, I watched my mother. Eleanor had stepped forward to read the citation over Arthur's slumping shoulder. For 20 years, she had believed his lies, believing she was married to a hard, tough man and that her daughter was fragile. Seeing the undeniable proof of my survival, of my strength, and watching the man who had terrorized her crumble into a pathetic, weeping mess in a parking lot, something inside her finally snapped. The trauma bond severed with an almost audible crack. Arthur fumbled for the door handle of his truck, expecting her to automatically climb into the passenger seat as she had done for 40 years. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her usual quiet submission. Eleanor stopped. She looked at the truck, then at Arthur, and finally at me. She straightened her spine. A subtle, beautiful elevation of her posture that erased 10 years from her face. No, Eleanor said. Her voice was quiet, but it was the loudest word she had ever spoken. She turned her back on him, walking over to where William and I stood. I am riding with Clara. We did not look back as we walked away, leaving Arthur standing completely alone in the sprawling lot. A broken man imprisoned by the very isolation he had tried to force upon me. If yours listen to this, I want you to know something vital about human dignity. For 20 years, I allowed a man's insecurity to dictate how much space I took up in my own family. We often confuse endurance with love. We think that by shrinking ourselves, taking the back seat, and silencing our achievements, we are keeping the peace. But true peace cannot exist without equality and respect. Covert narcissists will always try to convince you that your light is blinding them, hoping you will dim it yourself so they don't have to face their own darkness. The greatest lesson I learned that day wasn't about military rank or outsmarting a bully. It was about human rights, the fundamental right of every woman, every daughter, and every mother to exist fully and unapologetically in male-dominated spaces and within their own homes. My mother found her voice that day at 62 years old. It is never too late to draw a boundary. It is never too late to demand respect. You do not owe your abusers a front row seat to your life. Thank you for letting me share my story with you today. If you or someone you know is dealing with emotional abuse or toxic family dynamics, please know that you are not alone. And there is real support out there. Your mental health is your absolute most valuable asset. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to stand tall against someone who tried to make you feel small, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your own experiences in the comments below. This is a safe space, and we read every single one. Let's keep building a community of strong, empowered women. Until next time, stand tall, and always know your worth. The morning sun crested over the San Diego skyline, casting a warm, golden hue through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our hotel suite. For the first time in over 40 years, my mother, Eleanor, woke up in a room that was entirely her own, devoid of the suffocating, erratic energy that my father always brought with him. The silence in the room was not the tense, terrifying quiet that usually precedes a domestic explosion. It was a soft, breathable peace. I sat at the small glass dining table, sipping a cup of black coffee, watching the ocean waves roll in the distance. The events of the previous day still hummed in my veins like a lingering electrical current. Leaving Arthur in that parking lot had not been an act of cruelty, but an act of necessary surgical extraction. We had finally cut out a malignant presence that had been poisoning our family's ecosystem for decades. A few minutes later, the door to the bedroom opened, and Eleanor emerged. She was wearing a simple hotel bathrobe, her hair unstyled, completely stripped of the meticulously maintained facade she usually wore to avoid triggering Arthur's unpredictable temper. She walked over to the kitchenette, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat across from me. For a long time, we just listened to the rhythmic sound of the Pacific Ocean. I noticed her hands, resting flat on the table, steady and still. The incessant, nervous tremor that usually plagued her fingers, the physical manifestation of a woman perpetually walking on eggshells, was entirely gone. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs completely, a luxury she rarely permitted herself in her own home. "My phone has been ringing," Eleanor said quietly, her voice smooth and devoid of panic. "He left 14 voicemails. I haven't listened to a single one. For the first time in my life. Clara, I don't care what he has to say." The magnitude of that statement hung in the air, heavy and triumphant. I smiled, a genuine, profound smile that reached my eyes. In psychological terms, breaking trauma bonding is often described as waking up from a severe trance. The victim suddenly sees the abuser not as an all-powerful deity who controls their survival, but as a small, deeply flawed human being holding a curtain that has just been pulled back. Eleanor was looking behind the curtain. She was realizing that the man who had terrified her for so long had absolutely no real power over her outside of the power she had surrendered to him. Our quiet morning was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was William, dressed in civilian clothes, looking exhausted but remarkably lighter. He stepped into the suite and immediately walked over to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her in a fierce, protective hug. When he finally pulled away, he turned to me. The confident, newly minted Navy SEAL suddenly looked like a vulnerable younger brother carrying a heavy burden of guilt. He sat down heavily on the sofa and buried his face in his hands. "Clara, I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I should have said something." When he yelled that out in the auditorium, I just froze. I stood there on that stage in a uniform meant to represent courage, and I was too terrified of our father to defend you. I walked over and sat beside him, placing a firm, reassuring hand on his broad shoulder. "William, look at me," I commanded gently, using the tone I usually reserved for mentoring junior officers. He lifted his head, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You have absolutely nothing to apologize for," I told him, making sure every word carried the absolute weight of truth. "You were conditioned since childhood to survive in a war zone disguised as a family home. Arthur taught you that speaking up meant enduring catastrophic emotional violence. What happened yesterday was not your battle to fight. It was the culmination of a 20-year strategic defense that I built. I did not want you to intervene. I wanted you to witness it. I wanted you to see that his authority was a complete illusion, so you would never have to fear him again." William exhaled a long, shaky breath, the residual guilt visibly leaving his body. We spent the rest of the morning together, not as hostages to Arthur's toxic narrative, but as three independent adults finally introducing ourselves to one another. We talked about William's upcoming deployment, about Eleanor's plans to return home with a police escort to collect her belongings and file the divorce papers. and about my life in Washington, the real life that I no longer had to hide. There was no shouting, no walking on eggshells, and no shrinking to fit into the cramped boxes Arthur had assigned us. We were finally breathing the clean air of reality, and it tasted like absolute freedom. 2 days later, the salty breeze of the Pacific was replaced by the crisp, hyper-organized, and sterile atmosphere of the Pentagon. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my private quarters, buttoning the crisp white collar of my service uniform. I fastened the shoulder boards, the heavy gold stars catching the harsh fluorescent light, symbolizing a lifetime of sacrifice, strategic brilliance, and unbreakable resilience. For 20 years, I had mentally separated Clara the Admiral from Clara the daughter. I had believed that shielding my family from my authority was an act of humility, a way to keep the peace. But as I looked at my reflection, I realized that true leadership cannot be compartmentalized. Permitting abuse in one area of your life inevitably compromises the integrity of your entire foundation. Walking down the labyrinthine corridors of the Pentagon, the environment demanded absolute focus. ADs rushed past with classified folders. High-ranking officials offered crisp nods of acknowledgement. I stepped into a secure briefing room overlooking the Potomac River, preparing to authorize a massive logistical shift in the Pacific Fleet. As I took my seat at the head of the heavy mahogany table, surrounded by generals and defense secretaries, I felt a profound shift in my internal architecture. My mind was sharper, unburdened by the parasitic weight of my father's projected insecurities. When you stop expending massive amounts of psychological energy managing a toxic person's fragile ego, the sudden surplus of mental clarity is nothing short of extraordinary. I ran that briefing with a level of precision and absolute authority that left no room for doubt. Over the next 6 months, the ripple effects of that day in San Diego transformed our family's landscape entirely. Eleanor did not waver. With the support of legal counsel and the unbreakable backing of her children, she finalized her divorce from Arthur. The man who had once demanded center stage was left entirely alone in a house that echoed with his own irrelevance. Eleanor bought a small, beautiful cottage in Virginia, close enough to visit me in D.C. I will never forget the day I went to visit her and found her in the kitchen, casually deciding what she wanted to eat for dinner. It sounds trivial, but for a woman who had spent 4 decades cooking only what her husband demanded, the simple act of choosing her own meal was a monumental victory of human rights and autonomy. She was discovering her own tastes, her own schedule, and her own voice. William thrived in his deployment, freed from the oppressive shadow of Arthur's impossible expectations. He became an exceptional operator. He wasn't fighting to prove his masculinity to a broken father anymore. He was serving with genuine purpose and quiet confidence. As for me, I continued to rise in the ranks, but my perspective on command had evolved. I began heavily mentoring female officers, actively speaking on military panels about the insidious nature of coercive control and the absolute necessity of setting rigid boundaries, both on the battlefield and in our personal lives. I realized that the courage required to stand up to a foreign adversary is the exact same courage required to stand up to the tyrants who share our last name. As this chapter of my life comes to a close, I want to leave you with this final thought. Society often conditions women to be the peacekeepers, the shock absorbers for the emotional dysfunction of the men around them. We are told that family is everything, and that forgiveness is a mandatory toll we must pay to keep the family unit intact. But true peace is never achieved through the subjugation of your own dignity. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. Your potential, your intellect, and your right to exist unapologetically in any space you choose, whether it is a corporate boardroom, a military base, or your own living room, are non-negotiable. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. If my story has struck a chord with you, if you have ever had to become a gray rock to survive, or if you are currently fighting to reclaim your own voice from someone who wants to silence it, Please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your own victories, your own struggles, and your own boundary setting moments in the comments below. Let us build a formidable community of women who refuse to shrink. Remember, the truth is a weapon that never rusts, and your dignity is a fortress that no one can breach without your permission. Until our next story, hold your head high, protect your peace, and never, ever forget your worth. In the realm of psychology, there is a phenomenon known as an extinction burst. When you establish a firm boundary with a highly manipulative individual, they rarely accept it gracefully. Instead, when they realize their usual tactics of control are no longer effective, their behavior temporarily escalates. They throw everything at the wall, hoping that a sudden surge of drama, guilt, or aggression will force you to revert to your old, compliant self. For Arthur, his extinction burst arrived precisely 14 months after the incident at the naval base. He did not come to me directly, of course. Covert narcissists despise direct confrontation when they know they are outmatched. Instead, he utilized another classic manipulation tactic. He deployed a flying monkey. In psychological terms, a flying monkey is a third party, often a well-meaning but misguided family member, manipulated by the abuser into doing their bidding and breaking your boundaries on their behalf. My flying monkey arrived in the form of a phone call from my paternal aunt, Margaret. Aunt Margaret had always been the quintessential enabler in the Green family. She was a woman who believed that keeping up appearances was far more important than protecting one's mental health. And she had spent her entire life making excuses for the men in our family. I was sitting in my office at the Pentagon, reviewing a classified intelligence report, when my personal cell phone buzzed. Seeing her name on the screen, I knew exactly what the call would entail. I let it ring twice before answering, purposefully steadying my breathing. "Clara, it's Aunt Margaret." Her voice came through the receiver, dripping with manufactured sorrow. "I'm calling about your father. He isn't doing well. Clara, his health is failing, and he is just so heartbroken. He cries every time he mentions your name or your mother's name. Don't you think it's time to let this petty grudge go? He is an old man, and family is family." I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out the reinforced window at the Potomac River. 10 years ago, a call like this would have sent a spike of toxic guilt straight into my chest. I would have agonized over my duty as a daughter, questioning if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Society places a massive, disproportionate burden on women to be the healers of broken men, to sacrifice our own peace to manage their emotional dysfunction. But I was no longer that woman. "Aunt Margaret," I replied, my voice completely level and perfectly polite, employing the Grey Rock method even with his emissary. "I appreciate your concern, but my relationship with Arthur is not a matter for public family discussion. My boundaries are permanent. If you are calling to talk about anything else, I would love to catch up. But if you are calling to act as his messenger, this conversation is over." Margaret gasped, clearly offended that her emotional manipulation had hit a solid brick wall. "I can't believe how cold you've become. Clara, the military has turned you into a machine. He is your father. You only get one father. And when he is gone, you are going to regret treating him like a criminal." She was hitting all the classic notes of coercive control, guilt, shame, and the threat of future regret. "Margaret," I said, my tone remaining entirely unshaken, "Arthur is a biological relative who permanently lost the privilege of my company through decades of his own deliberate cruelty. I do not feel cold. I feel peaceful. I wish you the best." I ended the call and smoothly blocked her number. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt the profound, empowering clarity of a woman who refuses to negotiate with emotional terrorists. That weekend, I drove down to Virginia to visit my mother, Eleanor, slightly worried that Margaret might have attempted the same tactic on her. I found Eleanor in her backyard, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, happily kneeling in the dirt as she planted a row of vibrant hydrangeas. Her garden was spectacular, a blooming metaphor for a woman who was finally nurturing her own life instead of surviving in a barren wasteland. I poured us some iced tea and sat with her on the patio, gently bringing up the phone call from Margaret. Eleanor paused, wiping a smudge of soil from her cheek, and smiled a serene, unbothered smile. "Oh, Margaret sent me a deeply dramatic letter a few days ago." Eleanor chuckled softly, taking a sip of her tea. "Pages and pages about how Arthur is lost without me, how the house is falling apart, how it is my Christian duty to return and care for him in his old age." I looked at her carefully, searching for any sign of the old, fearful Eleanor. "What did you do with the letter, Mom?" I asked. Eleanor looked out over her beautiful, thriving garden, her eyes bright and clear. "I didn't even finish reading it, Clara. I put it straight into the paper shredder, right along with the junk mail. Arthur isn't lost without me. He is just angry that he has to do his own laundry and has no one left to yell at. My duty is to myself, and to the years I have left." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. The extinction burst had failed completely. Arthur had fired his final psychological weapon, and it had bounced harmlessly off the impenetrable armor of our newfound self-respect. We were finally, unequivocally free. A year later, the atmosphere in Washington, D.C., was electric with the vibrant energy of early spring. The cherry blossoms were in full, magnificent bloom, painting the city in soft shades of pink and white. It was a day of profound significance, completely devoid of the dark, suffocating tension that had defined that fateful afternoon in San Diego. Today was my formal promotion ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard. I was being elevated to the rank of Vice Admiral, earning my third star. But more importantly than the professional milestone, this day represented the ultimate culmination of our family's generational healing. There were no eggshells to walk on. There was no narcissist lurking in the periphery, waiting for a moment of vulnerability to strike. There was only light, dignity, and chosen peace. The reception hall was breathtaking, filled with high-ranking military officials, foreign dignitaries, and trusted colleagues. But the only people I truly cared about were sitting in the very front row. My mother. Eleanor looked absolutely radiant in a tailored sapphire blue dress. At 64 years old, she looked 10 years younger than she had when she was married to Arthur. Her posture was impeccable, her smile genuine and warm. Sitting right beside her was William, who had recently returned from a grueling, highly successful deployment overseas. He looked grounded, mature, and deeply proud. The empty space beside them was not a void. It was a testament to our collective strength. Arthur was nowhere near this building. He was completely powerless. A ghost from a past life who no longer had the clearance to enter our reality. When it was time for the pinning of the stars, a tradition usually performed by spouses or parents, I did not ask a senior commanding officer to do it. I called Eleanor and William to the stage. As my mother stood before me, her hands steady and sure, she pressed the heavy silver star into the fabric of my pristine white uniform. She looked up into my eyes, and in that silent exchange, we acknowledged everything we had survived. We acknowledged the decades of silence, the terrifying leap of faith it took to walk away, and the beautiful, hard-won peace we had built from the rubble. William pinned the other star on my right shoulder, offering me a crisp, flawless salute that carried no fear, only absolute, unconditional respect. I stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphones as I looked out over the sea of faces. Leadership is often defined by strategic victories, by the battles we win on foreign shores, and the adversaries we outmaneuver in the dark. I began, my voice steady and resonant. But the most difficult leadership test any of us will ever face does not occur in a war room. It occurs in our own homes, within our own minds. True authority begins with personal sovereignty. It is the absolute refusal to allow anyone, regardless of their title or their biological relationship to you, to diminish your humanity or dictate your worth. I looked directly at Eleanor, who was nodding softly, tears of quiet joy glistening in her eyes. We are taught that endurance is a virtue, but enduring abuse is not an act of nobility. It is a tragedy. True courage is the willingness to walk away from the familiar darkness and step into the terrifying, beautiful light of your own independence. When the ceremony concluded, the three of us stood on the balcony overlooking the Anacostia River, watching the boats glide peacefully across the water. The heavy, oppressive narrative that Arthur had forced upon us for a lifetime had been completely rewritten. We had not just survived his toxicity, we had thrived in its absence. We had proven that a woman's power is not determined by the men who attempt to keep her small, but by her own relentless, unbreakable will to rise. As we stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the afternoon, I realized that the greatest victory of my entire career was not the rank on my shoulders, but the genuine, unshakable smile on my mother's face. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to speak directly to your heart. Society is incredibly adept at making women feel guilty for choosing their own mental health over the comfort of toxic family members. You will encounter flying monkeys. You will face extinction bursts. You will be called selfish, cold, and unforgiving by people who benefit from your continued subjugation. Let them talk. Their misunderstanding of your boundaries is not your problem to solve. Your only obligation is to your own peace, your own safety, and your own dignity. You do not need anyone's permission to remove toxic people from your life. And you certainly do not need to apologize for refusing to be a casualty in someone else's emotional war. Thank you, truly, for listening to my story. If this narrative has helped you recognize your own strength, or if it has given you the courage to finally block that number, set that boundary, or walk out that door, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Share your own moments of liberation in the comments below. We read every single one. And your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today to change her life. We are building a fortress of empowered, educated, and unshakable women here. Keep protecting your peace. Keep standing in your truth. And never forget that your worth is absolute. Until next time, take care of yourselves. In the complex journey of psychological recovery from long-term emotional abuse, there is a profound milestone that survivors often speak about with quiet reverence. It is not the day you finally leave, nor is it the day you establish your first boundary. The ultimate milestone is the day you achieve complete, unbothered indifference. For decades, my mother, Eleanor, believed that the opposite of her trauma bond would be hatred. She thought she would have to spend the rest of her life actively fighting off feelings of resentment and anger toward my father, Arthur. But true healing is far more beautiful and much quieter than that. The true opposite of trauma bonding is not hatred. It is a profound, echoing nothingness. It is the moment you look at the person who once controlled your entire universe and realize they are simply a stranger whose opinions hold absolutely no weight in your reality. For Eleanor, this absolute psychological victory arrived 5 years after my promotion ceremony, during a brief, unavoidable legal encounter. There was a minor, long-forgotten administrative error regarding a small plot of rural land that had been in Arthur's family for generations. Because Eleanor's name was still technically on the original deed, she was required to sign a simple quitclaim document to formally release her legal interest, to avoid any unnecessary conflict. Her attorneys arranged for the signing to take place at a neutral mediator's office in downtown Richmond, Virginia. I offered to accompany her, prepared to act as a buffer against any of Arthur's lingering toxicity, but Eleanor gently declined. At 69 years old, she was a woman entirely transformed. She had spent the last several years traveling, cultivating deep friendships, and transforming her cottage into a vibrant sanctuary. She looked at me with a serene, confident smile and said, "Clara, I do not need a bodyguard to sign a piece of paper. He is just a man in a room." When Eleanor arrived at the polished mahogany conference table, Arthur was already seated across from her. It had been years since they last saw one another, and the contrast between them was staggering. Narcissists, when deprived of their emotional supply, the fear, the compliance, The drama they extract from their victims do not age gracefully. They tend to wither, consumed by their own bitter, rewritten narratives. Arthur looked incredibly old, his posture slumped, his face deeply lined with a permanent scowl of victimhood. He was dressed in a faded suit that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. Eleanor, on the other hand, walked into the room radiating a quiet, luminous grace. She wore a tailored beige trench coat over a simple silk blouse, her silver hair perfectly styled, her eyes bright and clear. She did not shrink. She did not hesitate. She took her seat directly across from him, placed her pen on the table, and offered a polite, professional nod, exactly as one would greet a bank teller or a distant acquaintance. Arthur could not handle the quiet dignity of her presence. Driven by the desperate, pathetic need to reestablish dominance and provoke an emotional reaction, he immediately leaned forward, a nasty sneer curling his lips. "You look tired, Eleanor," he muttered, his voice raspy and laced with venom. "I suppose life on your own isn't the grand fantasy you thought it would be. You always did need someone to take care of you. I bet you sit in that empty little house of yours and regret throwing away everything I provided." It was the exact same script he had used for 40 years, the coercive control, the belittlement, the projection of his own intense loneliness onto her. In the past, those words would have made Eleanor's hands shake. She would have lowered her eyes, swallowed her pride, and apologized just to keep the peace. But on this day, Eleanor simply looked at him. She did not argue. She did not defend her beautiful, fulfilling life. She did not offer him the exquisite satisfaction of her anger. She looked at him with eyes that held no fear, no sorrow, and no residual attachment. She picked up her pen, signed her name with a smooth, elegant flourish on the designated line, and pushed the document across the table. She stood up, gathered her handbag, and looked down at the man who had once been her greatest terror. "I wish you peace, Arthur," Eleanor said, her voice completely devoid of sarcasm, carrying only the genuine, gentle pity one might feel for a lost stranger. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving him sitting in the suffocating silence of his own irrelevance. She walked out into the bright Virginia sunlight, got into her car, and drove back to her beautiful life, never looking back. The legacy of healing is not merely about securing your own freedom. It is about keeping the door propped open so that others may follow you out of the dark. As I entered the twilight of my military career, serving my final years as a vice admiral at the Pentagon, my focus shifted heavily from active strategic deployment to the profound responsibility of mentorship. I made it my personal mission to identify and uplift young female officers who were navigating the treacherous, male-dominated waters of the armed forces, particularly those who carried the invisible, heavy burdens of toxic family dynamics. One afternoon, a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins knocked hesitantly on my office door. She was brilliant, boasting the highest analytical scores in her cohort. Yet she carried herself with a familiar, tragic smallness. Her shoulders were perpetually hunched, her eyes constantly scanning the room for disapproval. I recognized the posture immediately. It was the Grey Rock posture. It was the physical manifestation of a woman who had been repeatedly told that her light was too bright and her ambition was an inconvenience. Sarah sat in the leather chair across from my desk, her hands nervously twisting the fabric of her uniform trousers, through tears of exhaustion. She confessed that she was strongly considering resigning her hard-earned commission. Her family, entirely intimidated by her success and military rank, had launched a relentless campaign of emotional sabotage. They accused her of abandoning them, mocking her military achievements as arrogant, and aggressively demanding that she return to her small town to serve as a quiet, compliant caregiver for a deeply narcissistic parent. She was drowning in the exact same toxic guilt that had nearly consumed my own life 2 decades prior. She looked at me, desperate for permission to choose her own survival. "Admiral Vance," she whispered, her voice breaking. Am I a terrible daughter for wanting to stay here? Am I selfish for wanting to protect the life I have built, even if it breaks my family apart? I stood up, walked around my heavy mahogany desk, and sat in the chair directly beside her. I did not offer her a standard military pep talk about duty or resilience. Instead, for the first time in my career, I told a junior officer the complete, unvarnished story of my brother William's Navy SEAL graduation. I told her about the crushed identification card in the dirt, the burnt hamburger, the public humiliation, and the deafening, life-altering silence of 2,000 saluting warriors. I watched Sarah's eyes widen as she realized that the decorated vice admiral sitting in front of her had walked through the exact same psychological battlefield she was currently surviving. "Lieutenant Jenkins," I said, my voice carrying the unwavering certainty of decades of hard-won wisdom. "You cannot heal a toxic family system by sacrificing your own potential on their altar of insecurity. Your brilliance is not an insult to their mediocrity. You are not abandoning them. You are rescuing yourself. And you have every fundamental human right to protect your peace." Sarah did not resign her commission. She stayed. She thrived. And she learned to set boundaries made of reinforced steel. If you are listening to this story today, I want to leave you with a message that transcends military rank, family titles, and societal expectations. For generations, women have been socially conditioned to be the emotional shock absorbers for the dysfunction of others. We are explicitly taught that setting boundaries is an act of aggression, that choosing our own mental health is selfish, and that our primary value lies in our infinite capacity to endure suffering with a quiet smile. But I am here to tell you that this narrative is a lie designed to keep you small. Your absolute loyalty belongs to your own dignity. You do not owe your abusers a front row seat to your success. And you do not require a military rank to command absolute respect in your own living room. Whether you are dealing with a jealous parent, a coercive partner, or an enabling relative, remember that your silence does not buy peace. It only subsidizes their toxicity. Thank you for walking this incredible journey with me. If the stories of Clara, Eleanor, and William have resonated with your own experiences, or if you are currently gathering the courage to walk away from a toxic dynamic and reclaim your own sovereign life, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Share your own stories of boundary setting and emotional liberation in the comments below. This channel is not just a collection of stories. It is a safe, fiercely guarded sanctuary for women who are waking up to their own power. We read every single comment. And your unique story of survival might be the exact beacon of hope another woman desperately needs to see today. Keep defending your peace. Keep refusing to shrink. And never, ever forget your absolute, non-negotiable worth. Until next time, stand tall and take beautiful care of yourselves. As this story comes to a close, I want you to take a moment and reflect on the invisible, heavy weight so many of us carry. For generations, women have been quietly taught that keeping the peace requires our silence, our shrinking, and our endless endurance of toxic behavior, especially when it comes from our own family. We are socially conditioned to be the emotional shock absorbers for the insecurities of the men around us. But what Clara and Eleanor's journey teaches us is that enduring abuse is never a badge of honor, it is a cage. The most powerful weapon you have against a covert narcissist or a highly manipulative family member isn't your anger. It isn't your tears. And it certainly isn't your desperate attempt to prove your worth to someone who is absolutely committed to misunderstanding you. Your greatest weapon is your unbothered, absolute indifference. When you stop participating in their fabricated reality, when you refuse to give them the dramatic emotional reaction they are starving for, their power simply evaporates. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, it is an act of profound self-respect. You do not owe anyone a front row seat to your life if they cannot respect the space you occupy. Eleanor found her voice and walked away at 62 years old, proving that it is never, ever too late to rewrite the ending of your own story and step out of the shadows. Never let anyone convince you that you are asking for too much, simply because you are asking for basic human dignity. Protect your peace. Defend your boundaries fiercely. And remember that your worth is absolute. This content was meticulously researched, developed, and manually edited by our team with the sole purpose of bringing you meaningful value and empowering life lessons.